Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording here and share the screen back, and we are going to get into the Baroque era and talk a little bit about this and listen to a little bit of music. Okay, so the Baroque style of music, and what we call sometimes in music history the Baroque era, occurs from about 1600 to 1750. So this is the next era after the Renaissance. So we should be kind of building a timeline here, starting with the Middle Ages and then the Renaissance, and then we have the Baroque era is the next one. And the Baroque era is the first era that we actually have a lot of information about. Records are being kept a little better. A lot more of the music is written down, so we can go back and look at it and see what was going on during this time period. And also, in the Baroque era, we have a huge revolution in the way that music is written, the way that music sounds. So we really start to move into what we think of as our modern harmonic, the way that the modern harmonic language, the way that we spell chords, the way that we put chord progressions together, that develops in the Baroque era. And we're going to talk about that and talk about some chord progressions that come around during this time that are directly related to the pop music that you listen to on a regular basis. Okay. So the word Baroque is kind of a funky word, and it literally means elaborately ornamented, flamboyant, and bizarre. So it's very extravagant. Baroque art and architecture and music, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's very ornate. If you look at visual art from the Baroque period, there's a lot of motion. These are active scenes. And also it's very busy. There's a lot of stuff happening in there. The Baroque style across all art forms is said to fill up the space. You don't have a lot of big blank empty spaces. Okay, so if you're looking at Baroque visual art, there's going to be a lot of people and a lot of things happening in the artwork. If you're looking at Baroque architecture, it's very elaborate. There's a lot of extra decorations and filigree. You don't have big blank walls in Baroque architecture like you see in later on in some architectural periods. Gothic architecture has these big long columns and stuff, but in the Baroque style, those would all be very ornate and heavily decorated. In Baroque music, you don't hear a lot of silence. It fills up the space. There's always something going on. It's very busy. You might have noticed that from the daily listening we did today, that there was just a lot of stuff going on throughout the entire piece. So for Baroque music specifically, we have 6 composers that we're going to talk about overall. The 2 big ones are Bach, J.S. Bach, and George Frederick Handel. They are the 2 giants of Baroque composition, the 2 guys that are most well known, and 2 of the most popular classical music composers of all time. The other 4 that we're going to look at are Monteverdi, Henry Purcell, Corelli, and Vivaldi. Those are the other ones that are pretty commonly recognized. When we listen to the music of these guys, some of it is going to be stuff that you've heard before. There's a lot of Baroque music that's used in television, in movies, in commercials, all over the place. So you're going to hear this stuff a lot in your lifetime. We divide the Baroque era into 3 main phases: the early, middle, and late Baroque. And you'll notice that the late Baroque is actually the entire second half. So it is the largest of the 3 phases there. The early Baroque, from 1600 to 1640, we see a lot of homophonic textures. We take some of those ideas from the Renaissance, and we start to use those kind of thick chords that we built through the polyphony of the Renaissance, and we start to have a lot of homophonic music that's more like what we hear in like church hymns, where everybody's moving in harmony at the same time. Or we have music where you have a chordal accompaniment with a melody over the top of it. That is also homophonic in nature. And it's in this early Baroque era that we start to see that we start to hear, I should say, modern harmonic shifts happen. We start moving towards major and minor scales. We start building triads in a way that is more similar to what we're used to today. That for us, Baroque music is music that starts to sound a lot more familiar to us. It sounds more normal to us. Jonathan, you have a question? Okay, maybe that was an accident. Jonathan, you've got your hand raised in the collaborate session there. So if you have a question, feel free to just enter the chat. I'll catch it. Okay. In the middle of the Baroque era, from about 1640 to 1680, we see a shift towards the major and minor scales. We start to see that become the basis of musical composition. Whereas before we were using the church modes, now we're using the major and minor scales that again are going to sound more familiar to us. And by 1690, by the end of the Middle Baroque period, the major and minor scales have become the basis of musical composition. Most of the music that's written is using these major and minor scales. It's using the chords that we're used to hearing even today. And then by 1680, by the late Baroque, we start to hear the chord progressions developing in the way that we hear today. So, for example, one of the most well-known Baroque pieces, one of the most familiar Baroque pieces to you that you've probably heard before, starts with a cello line that goes like this. Have you guys heard that before? Trans-Siberian Orchestra has a piece built on it. There's actually the Maroon 5 song Memories uses that exact, really it quotes that piece a lot. It's a piece called Pachelbel's Canon in D. And the chord progression from Pachelbel's Canon is a very common chord progression used today. It sounds like this. And that really kind of gives us this new, it's a good example of this new way that we write chord progressions. And you can take variations of that, and it sounds more and more like music that we hear today. So I'm going to take that same chord progression, I'm going to put it in a different key, and see if this sounds fairly familiar to you. Is used over and over and over again. In fact, I've done the research, and there are about 405 songs that have made the top 100 in the last 100 years in American pop music that use that same chord progression. There's actually some funny videos out there about that chord progression, and uses some different songs that all use that same chord progression. You know, one of the most popular ones, I always screw it up if I try to play the whole thing, but starts like this. Right, you guys are familiar with that song, Don't Stop Believin' by Journey, uses that chord progression. You Say by Lauren Daigle uses that chord progression. When I Come Around by Green Day, Glycerine by Bush. I mean, those are just the ones that I know off the top of my head because they're the ones that are pretty familiar to me. And like I said, there's over 400 tunes that have made the top 100 over the last century in America that all use that same chord progression, right? It's very, very common chord progression, or at least some variations of it, okay? Sounds like the Office theme. I used to know the Office theme. I've arranged the Office theme before. It's like. I've arranged that for marching band before, so and my wife watches The Office religiously, so we that is ingrained in my head all the time. Okay, so those chord progressions become very common during the Baroque era, and that's why Baroque music is going to sound more familiar to you. It's going to sound a lot more pleasing than some of this other Gregorian chant and some of that other stuff that we listened to before. Okay, so with each era of music, we're going to look at some of the characteristics of the music that we hear. So one of the big characteristics of Baroque music, one of the defining traits, is this unity of mood, which is all about the emotional content of the music. In the Renaissance, other than with secular music, music did not generally express a lot of emotion. The church music especially was very flat. In the Baroque period, there's this idea called the doctrine of the affections, which means that music should always exhibit some kind of mood or some kind of emotion. If you're writing a piece of music, it should be trying to get a feeling across in somebody. And Baroque literature is the same way. If you look at Shakespeare, which is early Baroque literature, you know, his pieces, his plays and his writings always have a specific emotion that they're diving into and exploring. You know, from the very melancholy tragedies to the comedies, which are very silly and over the top. And Baroque music follows the same idea. If it's a happy tune, the whole tune is going to be very uplifting and happy. If it's supposed to be a more melancholic tune, then it's going to be very sad and emotional through the whole thing. And we're going to listen to several examples of that as we go along. Rhythmically, Baroque music tends to follow a lot of patterns, rhythmic patterns, that drive and keep the whole thing moving along. So we've got a lot of energy and drive in Baroque music. One of the pieces we're going to listen to today, the Brandenburg Concerto, has this consistent 16th note pulse that drives through the whole tune. And it gives it a lot more of a rhythmic vitality than we heard with Renaissance music. The melodies in Baroque music are extremely important. Composers really utilize those melodies, and they have these themes that they want to ingrain, and they want you to hear it over and over again. We're going to listen to a piece by Bach called The Little Fugue in G minor that starts with this. And we hear that over and over and over again in that tune. In fact, that's the whole point of the fugue, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. We have sequences show up a lot melodically, which is where we take a melodic phrase or a snippet and we're going to utilize it going up and down the scale. So if I had a part of my melody that went, and I wanted to add a little bit of motion to that and kind of transition into the next section, I might go. And using that same little 5-note phrase, I've moved up the scale and created this kind of sense of motion. Even something like. That's an idea of taking that theme and using it in sequence. Okay? And our melodies in Baroque music also tend to be very elaborate and ornamental. As we talked about, that's what Baroque is all about, that ornamental sounding music. And a lot of that ornamentation, is that the, or whatever, is created by the performer. If I'm a performer and I look at the page and I see a melody that looks like this, then I know as a performer, it's my job to elaborate that a little bit and to add some, some extra stuff to it there. So I'm going to do something like. And in the Baroque era, composers didn't write that stuff in. It was expected of the performers to be able to do that and to know that they were supposed to do that. As we get into the classical era, we'll see composers adding more and more detail to the sheet music, and it tells them to do things like that. But in the Baroque period, that was mostly improvised, right? Dynamically, we see consistent volumes throughout large sections of the piece. You don't have a lot of dramatic shifts back and forth. You'd have a long section that's all loud, and then we're going to do a long section that's all soft. And that's what we call terraced dynamics, where it's kind of, you know, it's all flat, and then it goes to this level, and then it goes to this level, and it looks like terraces, like those kind of stair-stepped way that you might see like a skyline or something. Texturally, late Baroque is primarily polyphonic, and really late Baroque music is the height of polyphony in classical music. It gets so complex and so over the top with the polyphony that it becomes almost difficult to listen to. One of the Bach pieces we're going to listen to in a minute is an organ piece, and there's so much going on at the same time that it becomes difficult to listen to and difficult to understand what's going on. Very, very complex stuff going on there. And again, a lot of imitation. That's what the fugue is all about, imitating the same melody over and over again. And we have the harpsichord and the organ as the two main keyboard instruments. As I said, the piano as we know it doesn't exist yet in the Baroque era. So we have the organ, which we have in church, and you guys you know, are probably familiar with what an organ sounds like. Oh, I'm back on the piano. That doesn't sound like an organ. Right? And then you have the harpsichord. These aren't labeled, so it takes me a minute to get there sometimes. So the harpsichord was a predecessor to the piano that has the strings laid out like a piano, but on a piano, the strings are actually struck by little hammers with felt on them. And that is what gives the piano its sound. With the harpsichord, the strings are actually plucked. There's these little quills that come up and pluck the strings, so it sounds, it gives it this bright sound, almost like a banjo or something like that. So you get this very Baroque sounding. It just sounds Baroque. You know, when you listen to Baroque music, you're going to hear that texture in there a lot of the times. Okay, the way that our chord progressions work is that we have these common chord progressions that mesh with the melodic line, and then the bass part serves as the foundation for the harmony. And we have this idea called the basso continuo. And I want to kind of explain this a little bit. It's an important part of Baroque music to understand, and it really illustrates some of the improvisatory nature of Baroque music. So let me find an example of a basso continuo here to show you what it might look like. I used to have one, and I don't know where it ended up. So the performers that will be looking at a figured bass or a basso continuo part will be looking at a bass line with some symbols written over the top of it. They're not going to get a full they're not going to get the full sheet music like what you might expect to see on a keyboard part. Or I usually have this pulled up already. This is a good one. Okay. Oh my gosh. Just show me the thing. All right. So here's an example of what that might look like. So we have a bass line written, and then we have these symbols underneath, and that those symbols actually tell the pianist or the harpsichord player or the lute player what chords they're supposed to play. So in this case, if I see a B flat by itself, I'm going to go back to piano here. I know that I've got to play that B flat in the bass, but with the symbol that's written there with the 6 underneath it, that actually tells me that it's a G minor chord with the B flat in the bass. Okay, so I might, let's find a better voicing for that. And then that next one tells me that I have an A, so the bass line goes. But what I'm actually playing is going to sound like this. Okay, so it gives me the information that I need to be able to play that. And keyboard players and instrumentalists during the Baroque era were expected to be able to do that. They were expected to be able to look at these figured bass parts and automatically figure out the chords. It's kind of like looking at a chord sheet or something like a fake book in jazz or in pop music. Okay, so the actual notation there is called figured bass. So if you have a question about that, that's what it's talking about. All right, we still have some word painting and text painting during this time period, but we do see some of the medieval style of having a single syllable with a bunch of notes around it, like we saw in the Middle Ages. Okay, we're getting close to actually listening to some music now and getting through all the basic stuff here. So the Baroque orchestra is based on the string family, the violin family of instruments. This is the earliest form of an orchestra that we're going to see. These are very small orchestras by modern standards. You have a couple of violins, a couple of violas, a couple of cellos, and probably one bass viol as the kind of bass voice there. But then we also sometimes see a lute or a guitar and a harpsichord in there as well, which is what we call the basso continuo unit. So you would have the guitar, the harpsichord, and the cello are all looking at the same part. The cello is just playing the bass line, and the harpsichord and the guitar or the lute are playing the chords over the top of it, right? And this is the first time that we start to see composers specifying the instrumentation. We saw that a little bit at the end of the Renaissance period, but in the Baroque era, that really becomes the norm for us to, for the music to specifically say, this is a trumpet part, this is a cello part, this is a violin part. It's not just laid out and you kind of guess and figure out how you want to play it on your own. We have a bunch of Baroque forms that are used. We do have multi-movement works show up here, kind of like we had with the Mass that we looked at Renaissance. This is a large piece of work that's split up into smaller individual movements that all are going to have, they're going to feel like a standalone piece, but they work as part of a larger piece of music. These sometimes take the form of suites, or of other works that we're going to look at that have like a first, second, third, and fourth movement to them. And a lot of times the movements are going to contrast. You'll have the first movement will be very fast-paced and kind of upbeat. The second movement will be slow and solemn. The third movement will be more of a dance type, and then we'll close with another kind of upbeat feel. You've got some common forms, but we're not going to dig too much into forms. In the Baroque era, we have the way that music works in Baroque society is a new thing for us. It's kind of like what we saw at the end of the Renaissance, where we have all of these different courts, and we have musicians that are part of the courts of this nobility and the aristocracy that have these, if you're wealthy enough to have a castle and all these people working for you, you're going to have a court music director and you're going to have musicians on staff there. These larger courts, the more wealthy people, the emperors and kings and people like that, are going to have very large court ensembles, up to 80 to 100 people working within, that are going to be part of the day-to-day life of the court. You have different musicians for dinner, or for announcing that somebody has arrived, or for the garden. So you've got all these musicians that you can use, including a full set of singers, including opera singers. So a lot of courts have their own private opera that they put on. They have composers that are writing operas specifically for the courts as kind of private performances. So they have to have, they employ a large number of opera singers there. The court music director had a lot of jobs. It was a pretty sweet gig to have, but it was a time-consuming one. You did a lot of stuff, supervising, directing performances, composing new works, disciplining musicians, kind of making sure they're well-trained. Also, a lot of court music directors were in charge of teaching lessons. So if you had, the king wanted the princess to learn how to play the piano, a lot of times that was the court music director's job, was to teach them. And because of that, a lot of court music directors became very close to the people they worked for. In fact, there were some cases where the court music director ended up marrying his students. He would marry the princess because they became very close in those music lessons. That happened a lot during the Baroque era. A lot of aristocrats did learn how to play music because of that. Like in the Renaissance, it was seen as very fashionable to be able to play music and to read music. We did have a few public opera houses during this time, but they were primarily smaller private ones. And we did have music careers taught by apprenticeship, which is different than what we see today. If you want to be a professional musician today, you either have to get lucky and be a pop musician that just happens to be discovered, which is like a 1 in a million chance, or you have to go to school and study to be a professional musician. If I wanted to be a violin player in the New York Philharmonic, well, then I would have to get as good as I possibly could, go to a really good college, go and get my master's degree and doctorate in violin performance from someplace like Juilliard, and then maybe I would have a chance of winning an audition into one of those symphony orchestras. Most professional musicians in the classical world have degrees in music, and that's part of where they get their training for doing that stuff. Now, in the pop world, it's more about connections and knowing people. What's really disheartening when you look at popular musicians is that most of the time you can trace them back to basically somebody was wealthy enough to get them into a record label. I promise I'm not trash talking Taylor Swift. I actually like Taylor Swift's music. I think that she's a very talented musician, but Taylor Swift's dad was rich and was able to buy her way into a record label when she was young, and that's how she got her start. And this is one of the most disappointing ones if you're a 90s kid like me, so we're familiar with Kid Rock, right? Kid Rock's whole persona is like this trailer trash guy from Detroit, Michigan. It turns out that Kid Rock's parents were actually millionaires, and he lived in like a 6,000 square foot house in Michigan. His dad was a car dealership owner and owned a bunch of car dealerships in Detroit. So he had money, and that was why he was able to get into the record labels and to be able to be successful. That's one of the reasons I love the YouTube and SoundCloud and even things like Bandcamp and stuff like that now, because it's so much easier to discover music by people that don't have the kind of money to get into the major record labels. I'll get off my soapbox on that. But in the Baroque era, if you wanted to be a professional musician, you actually would get an apprenticeship. You would go and if I wanted my daughter to become a professional pianist when she was probably the age that she is now, she's 10, I would go to a professional piano and I would hire her out as an apprentice. So she would probably live with whoever her teacher was, and she would work for them all day long. She would basically be their servant, kind of, where she would learn how to write music, and they would work as what's called a copyist, where the composer would write a piece of music all into a score, and then it was the apprentice's job to take the score and to write out a violin part and a cello part and all those individual parts. And then they would also learn how to play music from the music teachers there. Okay, I want to get to the Concerto Grosso because I do want to listen to this piece before we end today. So the Concerto Grosso is a form that comes around. It's kind of a predecessor to the modern concerto and even to the symphony. It's what really leads us into this idea of having these multi-movement instrumental works. This is for a small group of soloists and an orchestra, like we saw with the Telemann Concerto that we listened to, where we had trumpet, violin, and cello as the solo instruments, and then the rest of the string orchestra as kind of the backup part. And this is a multi-movement work, usually in 3 movements. Now, memorize this because it's going to show up over and over and over again. And if you can memorize this now, it's going to be a lot easier when we get into the classical era and start talking about the movements of the way that the movements work in symphonies. Okay, so in the Concerto Grosso, it's 3 movements, and they usually go fast, slow, fast. That's all you have to remember. Fast, slow, fast. The first movement is a fast-paced, upbeat movement. The second movement is going to be slower and usually quieter. And the third movement is going to be, again, a fast-paced movement that is usually based on some kind of dance. It's usually dance-like. Okay, we're not going to talk too much about ritornello form. But we are going to talk about the Brandenburg Concerto. So this is the first piece of your listening assignments for part 3, the Brandenburg Concerto, one of the Brandenburg Concertos by J.S. Bach, some of the most famous pieces of classical music ever written. It's a Concerto Grosso, and the first movement is in ritornello form, written somewhere around 1721. And as we would expect for the first movement here, it's going to be fast. It's going to be allegro, right? You've got flute, violin, and harpsichord as the soloists for the Brandenburg Concerto, and then the string orchestra. And I want you to listen while we're listening to it, and we're going to be able to see it too because we're watching a live performance of it. You'll notice that you have this contrast in texture where the harpsichord takes over for a while, and then the violin becomes the main section, and then the flute becomes the main performer, and it changes the sound. We have this contrast as it goes around. But again, in Baroque music, there's never any silence. It's a lot of busy stuff happening all throughout the piece. It can actually be very complex and a little overwhelming. And concertos are designed to show off the performers, and the Concerto Grosso is really designed for that. So Bach wrote this piece for specific flute, violinists, and harpsichord players to show off their skills and show off their virtuosity. So let's listen to the first movement here of Brandenburg Concerto number 5, at least some of the first movement, and I will let you go after that. So did you hear what I was talking about, where it's just super busy? It never stops. There's always something going on there. Okay, and that's a very exemplary of the Baroque style of writing, and we're going to hear more and more of that as we go along. All right, that's your intro to the Baroque period. I will see you on Thursday. If you have any questions, I'll be around here for a few minutes.